Hi, I'm James Gailliard, and welcome to In Black and White, where we offer clear, challenging, and compelling conversations and commentaries on the issues that matter most. Whether it's public policy, personal development, a master's class, a critical conversation, a Bible study, or a subject in the news cycle, I hope today's episode informs you, and I hope it inspires you. Well, this is James Gailliard. Welcome to In Black and White. Glad you are joining me today for the show. Today, guys, I want to talk about, I've been getting a lot of feedback from people, and one of the things people have said to me is, would you do a show on like how things happen? Like, give us a snapshot of the inner workings of the General Assembly in North Carolina. And I think this probably works the same in all states or very similar. And people are saying, walk us through the structure of things. Walk us through, educate us, if you will, on what happens in North Carolina General Assembly so that how does a bill really become a law in North Carolina? What's the steps it has to go through? What's the process it has to go through? So that's what I want to talk about on today's show, kind of the inner workings of the North Carolina General Assembly. As you know, I serve House District 25, which is in eastern rural North Carolina, and I serve also the city of Rocky Mount, which is the big municipality that I serve in. And so let me walk you through some inner workings of this. I think it's going to be very informative. And so let me begin, first of all, by saying to you that, just as a reminder, that you have two chambers, right? You've got the Senate and you have the House of Representatives. And just by the way, this looks very similar on the federal level. So in the state level, you've got the State House, that's the House of Representatives, and you have the Senate. Here in North Carolina, you have 120 House members. So we have 10.5 million people in North Carolina. You have 120 people in the State House. Those are House of members, representatives, that serve those 10.5 million people. The Senate serves a larger number of people, so you don't have as many. North Carolina, we have 50 state senators, okay? Now, you can compare that to the House of Representatives. You have, in terms of U.S. House of Representatives, 435, and those are congressmen, 435 congressmen. And in the Senate, you have 100, right? 50 per state, two per state. So we have 120 people in the State House. In order for a bill to become law, you need a majority of people in the State House voting aye, which is yes, on the bill. So out of that 120, then, we need 61 aye votes or 61 yes votes. Once it gets to the House floor, I'm going to talk about the path in a minute. Once it gets to the House floor, and in the Senate, because you have 50 people, you have to have 26 votes, right? It's 50% plus vote. Once that bill gets passed through those chambers, then it goes to the governor for either a signature or veto, or he gets to allow it to become law without him doing anything. So that's the Cliff Notes version. Now, let me wind this on back. So this is what happens. Guys like me get elected to the General Assembly, and we start seeing things that are wrong, or talking to our constituents, or listening to advocacy groups, or listening to PACs, or listening to lobbyists, and we start drafting legislation. Now, what happens is when you get elected, you get assigned a group of committees. There are over 40 committees. The committee structure is really complicated. There are over 40 committees in the State House in North Carolina. I'll rattle off a few of them. So you have your appropriations committees, right? Those are the committees that make a decision on how the money gets spent. The biggest bill we do every session, we have two-year sessions, right? And when we come in on our 2-year cycle, we always come in on even number years. So we're in we come in on odd number years. And so we're serving 21, we served all of 21, and we're serving out 22. When we come in on odd number years, The main piece of legislation is the state budget, the budget bill. It's the biggest bill and the most important bill that we pass every session. So we spend a lot of time. So you have several appropriations committees. Now, I'm going to give you the down and dirty of this, okay, because I think it's important that you know. And I can't tell you how many calls and emails I get from people about why certain pieces of legislation are not moving. And I think I get those calls, and please, I encourage you to keep calling, keep asking. But a lot of times people don't exactly know how legislation becomes law and what the process is, which is why I'm explaining it. So you get assigned committees based upon preference, and sometimes it's based upon what the Speaker of the House, who's the highest ranking person in the House, it depends on how politicized he or she is. We unfortunately have a highly politicized environment in our state house, unfortunately. And so many times the minority members, that doesn't mean African American. The minority members of the state house are the people that are in the party with the least number of people. So in North Carolina, because our district lines have been so severely gerrymandered, Democrats are in the minority. The reason I make that statement is because it is true. In every recent election, Democratic candidates have received more votes than Republican candidates. So you would think, conventional wisdom, if Democrats received more votes than Republicans, Democrats would be in the majority. But what happens is the Republican Party, whoever the governing party is at that time, the majority party, gets to draw maps. They have historically drawn maps so that either groups of people are packed into certain districts, or people, some of those maps look like little squiggly lines, literally. They're not nice, neat drawings. They're squiggly lines. I literally ran in 2 election cycles where people who lived on the exact same street in the city of Rocky Mount stood on their front porches looking at each other and were in 2 different drawn districts. If you know anything about North Carolina politics, you know literally the General Assembly, the Republican-controlled General Assembly, drew a line straight down North Carolina A&T's campus. So some of the students in certain dorms were in one district, congressional district, and some were in a different congressional district. So that's what I mean about either packing voters into one district or really stretching them out into different districts, right? That's a mechanism for control. If you're not familiar with the term gerrymandering, I'll give you the layman's version of it. It's the manipulation of political lines in order for a specific party to maintain power. And so in North Carolina, we have gerrymandered districts, and as a result of that, Republicans are in control. And because Republicans are in control, they get to choose the Speaker of the House. In our case, it's Tim Moore. And so he's been the Speaker of the House a number of years. He then is responsible for committee assignments. We have over 40 active committees. We have several appropriations committees. We're supposed to have appropriations for capital, appropriations for education, appropriations for general government, et cetera, justice, appropriations for information technology. In our 2021 budget cycle, literally, we were at a point where some of the appropriations, I'm on appropriations capital as an example, and some of our appropriations groups didn't even meet, right? They just bypassed the whole committee structure. That's a whole nother conversation. And so the Speaker will appoint people to committees. Now, the way it's supposed to work by rules is that the committee structure should look like the makeup of the state, and the makeup of the General Assembly. And so if you've got, 60% controlled by Republicans, then your committee structure should have like 60% Republicans, 40% Democrats. In many situations, that's not how committees are drawn. And then additional people are packed. So just the same way you've heard people talk about Democrats threatening to pack the Supreme Court. Well, Republicans pack their committees. So what they do is they put a significantly higher number of Republicans on the committee so as to minimize the voice of the opposing party. Now, the reason this matters for us is because we're supposed to represent the people who sent us. And so by minimizing the voice of the minority party, you're really minimizing the voice of the average North Carolinian. Now, I know you're saying, well, then why do we vote for people who are in the minority party? Well, there's lots of ways we can help, and we do help, and I'm going to talk about that before we get done today. So what happens is you get an idea for a bill. So as an example, 2021, I think, I sponsored a bunch of bills, but you sponsor a bill or you have a bill idea, you go to bill drafting. Bill drafting in terms helps you get the language of the bill together to make sure that it's legal, to make sure it jives with the state constitution, to make sure it jives with general statute. You write the bill. When you write the bill, you then file the bill. Once you file the bill, and this is a part of the reason why this stuff takes so much time, guys. Once you file the bill, it gets posted. And when the bill gets posted, the rest of the General Assembly has the opportunity to co-sponsor the legislation. So when you file the bill, you have several people who are the primary sponsors. So you may work with 2 or 3 other representatives. In some situations, you're working by yourself, but you're working with 2 or 3 other people, and together you become the primary sponsors of the bill. That primary sponsored bill gets placed on the dashboard, which is an electronic database, if you will, of all the bills. And all of this is available for public view. Then the rest of the members of the General Assembly have the opportunity in the House to co-sponsor the legislation. Once that opportunity to co-sponsor the legislation is complete, the bill gets what's called a first reading. So they read the bill in. When the bill gets read in the first time, the Speaker of the House then sends the bill on a pathway. So let's just say, hypothetically, the bill is about education. What'll happen is he'll say, okay, then this bill has to go to education K-12. Say if it has a financial component to it, it has to go to finance. Let's say it has something to do with how local school districts are going to run. It might go through state and local government. So it is given a pathway. Let me give you some examples of some of the standing House committees that a bill could go through. Banking, commerce. I mentioned all the appropriations already. Education community college, education K-12, education universities, election law, the environment, ethics, family, children, and aging, federal relations and American Indian affairs, finance, health, homeland security and military affairs, insurance, several judiciary committees, 1 through 4, local government, land use and planning, marine resources and agricultural, pensions and retirement, redistricting, regulatory reform, rules, calendars, operations of the House, state government, state personnel, transportation, the UNC Board of Governors nominations, and wildlife resources. That's a lot. Those are just the House standing committees. You have also non-standing committees and House select committees. I'm not going to get into that today with this broadcast. And so what happens is the Speaker will say, okay, these are the 5 committees, 4 committees, 3 committees, whatever, that the bill has to go through before it comes back to the House floor. So first reading is on the House floor. At that time, it's given a pathway. It starts working its way through committee. Now, the chairman of committees, they don't have to take the bill up. So if they don't like the bill, they have a political reason for not taking up the bill, it may not see the light of day. Sometimes bills are what we say buried in committee. That is a very deliberate and intentional process. I personally don't agree with that. I think every bill gets a fair hearing, and if it flunks, it flunks. If it passes, right? But it should get a fair hearing. So sometimes bills literally die in committee. Like as I'm recording this, and the last committee for bills to go through is always Rules, Calendar, and Operations of the House. It's the last standing committee. Right now in the House Rules Committee, there are over 250 pieces of legislation that have just been buried there. If I were to begin going through every House committee in North Carolina, upwards of 500 bills just get buried in committee. So what happens is the work of the bill, amending it, working through issues, debating it, deliberating for it, all of that happens in our House committee meetings, right? So let's say it's Medicare, right? Medicaid expansion, rather. And the bill gets drafted. I can't tell you how many times we've drafted a bill to expand Medicaid in North Carolina. We still haven't done it. It's a massive failure to our state. We have filed bills upon bills to get Medicaid expanded. Those bills generally will go directly to the House Rules Committee to die. Sometimes bills will go to committee. Once the bill gets in committee, the members of that committee then begin debating the bill. They begin putting what's called amendments on the bill. Sometimes the amendments are friendly, meaning the bill sponsors are like, hey, that's a good idea. You just made my bill better. And they'll agree to it. And sometimes they aren't friendly, where they can radically gut significant portions of a potential bill or bill and radically change the outcome of it. And the sponsors are like, nope, don't like that bill. So it go through committee, assuming they make it through all of their committees with a yes vote. Now, if it gets voted no in any committee, the bill is dead. That's it. That's the end of it. If it gets through all of its committees, the bill then goes to the House Rules Calendar and Operation of the House Committee. It's the last committee. Assuming it gets through Rules Committee, the next stop then is it goes back to the House floor for a second reading. When it goes back to the House floor for the second reading, that's when it gets debated on the House floor. Now, mind you, a whole bunch of the debate should have already happened in committee. But it goes back to the House floor for debate. Generally, that is where your political posturing happens. That's where people are smiling nice for the cameras. That's where people are making their debates. Sometimes those debates can drive you crazy because everything has already been said. It's just everybody hasn't said it. So everybody has to say it. And it can go on and on forever. And so it gets debated in the second reading. And the speaker will say something like, those who are in agreement will vote aye. Those will vote no. Clerk will open the vote. You get to vote aye or no. They close the vote after a certain number of seconds. You look up at the board to see how people have voted, to see whether or not it passes. Most bills can then immediately be read a third time. Bills have to be read 3 times on the House floor to become law or to get out of the House. It can immediately, for the most part, there's certain bills that can't be read immediately a third time, but many can. And so, like the appropriations bill cannot, example, the budget bill, but many can. Once it passes the second time, at the third time is generally a voice vote. And the speaker will say, those in agreement will say aye, those who are against will say no. And then we say aye or no. The speaker carries the motion. And at that point, if the bill originated in the House, the state House, it then is sent by messenger to the state Senate. When that bill goes to the state Senate, fully having been vetted through all the committees on the House, it will go through the same process in the Senate. It will get read in. It will be assigned committees. It will go through committees, and it can die anywhere in the Senate. And let me tell you, in North Carolina, a lot of great pieces of legislation get buried in the state Senate, unfortunately. Assuming it, now mind you of this, while the House is doing this, the Senate is doing the same thing. So while we are running our bills through our committee structure, the state Senate is running their bills through the committee structure. If those bills don't, what's called cross over, if the Senate bills don't cross over to the House and the House bills don't cross over to the Senate by a specific date, then the bill is dead. So this is fast-moving stuff, y'all. So we then send our bill to the Senate. It goes through the same committee structure. Assuming the Senate votes our bill and the Senate sends us bills and we vote those bills, and both chambers, the Senate and the U.S. House, the state House, approve the bill, the next stop is the governor's desk. The governor generally has a handful of days, I think it's like 10 days, to sign it into legislation. Some bills he just immediately signs, and some bills he sits on it and deliberates. Some bills are going to be dead on arrival, and the governor's going to veto those bills. Now, when the governor vetoes pieces of legislation, they come back to the chamber that initiated the bill. So if it was a Senate bill, it goes back to the Senate. If it's a House bill, it comes back to the State House. At that point, the Speaker of the House or Senate Pro Tem, who's the head person on the state Senate, they have the opportunity to do nothing, which means that bill just did not become law because the governor vetoed it, or they can place it on the calendar of the House. The calendar of the House is where all of our bills and all of our activity is posted for any given day. So every time we're in session, you can publicly see what the House calendar is. And you can see all the pieces of legislation that we're going to be voting on that particular day or how they're moving. Or you can see it electronically as well. Speaker of the House will either place that veto bill back in front of us or not. The only way he's going to place it back in front of us is if he thinks he has the votes to override the governor's veto. Sometimes he knows he doesn't have the votes to override the governor's veto, but he still wants us to go on record in terms of how we're going to vote, and that's where it becomes very political. We are in North Carolina in a situation where we do not have a supermajority, thank God. And I don't think any state should have a supermajority. Let me tell you what a supermajority is. A supermajority is where you have enough elected officials to override a governor's veto just by the will of their own party. In North Carolina, you will hear that Governor Roy Cooper has vetoed more bills than any other governor. That's true. He's vetoed more bills than any other governor because we've had more bad bills in front of us than any other governor. And so one of the reasons it's important to make sure supermajorities are not enacted, and that's why it's important for us to vote, is so that there's another layer of protection against extreme bills. We will see very extreme gun bills, very extreme abortion bills. We will see bans on contraception. You will see very extreme bills. And you know, I advocate and fight for life in the womb and life in the world. When I say very extreme abortion bills in North Carolina, I mean 10-year-old girls being raped by their uncles, being forced to carry a child to term. That's what I mean by extreme. So I'm talking about bans on married couples saying we don't want to have a family right now, so we're going to get contraception so that we don't get pregnant. We're talking about those. I'm talking about 30-year-old professional women who find out that they have a pregnancy in their fallopian tube or, in one of their tubes, and the doctor says without surgery or without some interception here, you are going to die. And the legislation saying she does not have the right to save her own life. That's what I mean by extreme, okay? In North Carolina, if we were ever to get into a supermajority, you will see extreme pieces of legislation immediately. The governor will veto them, but if they have a supermajority, they will just override the governor's veto, and those issues will become law anyway. So that's the state of how bills become laws in North Carolina. Let me say something to you. Don't just pay attention to bills that pass. Pay attention to bills that were filed that don't move. Because if you have a Democratic or Republican representative and they file a bill and that bill does not move, you should not be calling the person or emailing the person who has filed the bill asking them why isn't it moving. You should be talking to those who are in authority over the committee structures saying, why isn't the bill moving? So understand how it becomes law. You've got to have the majority of people saying yes, which means you've got to have Democrats and Republicans weighing in on every issue. So that's the snapshot version of how bills become laws in our state. So I've talked to you about our executive branch activity, our legislative branch activity. So the legislative branch is the one who's getting the bills passed. The executive branch is the one who's signing those bills into becoming law. And then once those bills become law, they get embedded, if you will, into the general statute, and they're required to be executed or implemented by state agencies like Department of Health and Human Services, or Department of Public Instruction, or Department of Transportation, or Department of Commerce, or Information Technology, or Wildlife Resources, or Agriculture. The reason this matters is because that's an additional level of influence that your state representative or your state senator has. And so a lot of times people feel like, well, why should I vote for a person who I know will be in the minority when they really won't have power and authority? Well, first of all, they have power and authority to stop really bad pieces of legislation from happening. They have power and authority to make really bad bills good or better. They have power and authority to make good bills even better. And what my favorite is, they have power and authority to influence the implementation of legislation at the state and local level by engaging in those state agencies and those secretaries. So that is a significant place of influence for the person, perhaps, that represents you. I actually spend a third of my time doing what I just described on this show, in terms of bills being filed and amended and sponsored. Third of my time with the people that sent me to Raleigh to begin with, and a third of my time at state level offices, building relationships so that when we have to implement pieces of legislation, there can be an element of influence to really benefit the people that I represent, and people specifically in rural Eastern North Carolina, because I really have a heart. I represent rural Eastern North Carolina, and that's what I really care about. So the last piece is the judicial piece. And the judicial piece happens when something happens in the General Assembly. The governor either signs it or doesn't sign it, or maybe it's not subject to a gubernatorial signature, like drawing of maps. And the judicial branch comes in when a lawsuit is filed because something was happening that was against the general statute or against the Constitution. A great example is North Carolina. I'm going to do a whole show on this. North Carolina is one of the few states in the country that has a constitutional requirement. Hear me. There is a constitutional requirement in North Carolina to provide every child with a sound basic education. So when you hear about the Leandro ruling, that was because the state of North Carolina was governed by its constitution to provide a certain amount of basic fundamental education to students. We were not doing it legislatively, so we were sued. The state General Assembly was sued in court. That case was won by the courts and have mandated now by law the General Assembly to properly fund basic education. Unfortunately, the Republican-controlled General Assembly has not adhered to that court ruling, which is why we still have so much chaos going on throughout our state as it relates to public education. There's a lot more I could say, but I wanted you to get an understanding of the process. This is what I would encourage you to do, and I'll do a whole show about this. Know who your General Assembly member is in terms of the state house. Know who your state senator is. Know who your congressional member is. Know who represents you on city council. Know who represents you on county commissioners. Know who represents you on the school board. Because all of the legislation that comes from the state into these areas are then administered by those additional groups of people. I'll do a whole new show on this. I hope this helped you. Did you learn something about how bills become law and the process? I hope you have. I hope you'll share this with someone else. I'm James Gailliard. If you have show topic ideas, email me at james@jamesgailliard.com. Subscribe to my outlet, all my podcast information. Comment on my YouTube channel. And again, thanks for joining me. Thanks for watching today. Well, we're out of time for today. I hope the episode informed you. Hope it inspired you. If you enjoyed it, would you go ahead and subscribe to my podcast? Would you also consider following me on one of our social media outlets, whether it's LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at JD Gailliard. We'd love to also hear your ideas about future episodes. So go ahead and email me at james@jamesgailliard.com. And finally, go ahead on my website, jamesgailliard.com, and respond to our poll for the week. Thanks again for listening. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.